Hey everybody, this is John Assaraf, and welcome to another amazing interview where I bring you some of the most brilliant minds in the world, people who are on the cutting edge of thinking, feeling, and more importantly, of really making a big difference in the world. And with me today is Ron Siegel, who is the Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School, where he's taught for over 30 years, and he's written 3, 4 books. One of his most recent ones is The Mindfulness Solution, which is absolutely excellent. And he's a longtime student of mindfulness meditation, and he serves on the board of directors and faculty of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. And I had a chance to watch some of Ron's videos a few weeks ago and really fell in love with the way he taught mindfulness and just his real understanding of how do you really pay attention and be aware of your day-to-day thinking, emotions, behaviors, and life. And more importantly, how do you start to develop a mindfulness practice, which has been talked about in every major magazine, TV show, radio, on earth in the last couple of years. And you probably have not been on any media in the last 3 years if you don't know what mindfulness is about. However, we are going to start by really talking about what, Ron, is mindfulness. And by the way, thanks for agreeing to do this with me.
Thanks so much for inviting me. So what is mindfulness? Well, mindfulness is actually an attitude toward our experience. It's an attitude that we cultivate toward our thoughts, toward our feelings, toward the sensations, toward being alive in the world. And the attitude has 3 components to it. It's about being aware, so knowing what's going on at the moment, of present experience, so it's about being aware of what's happening right now rather than about fantasies of the past or fantasies of the future.
Yep.
And it's about being able to accept whatever arises in the mind and the body each moment. And if you put those together and you say, okay, so it's awareness of present experience with acceptance, that sounds real simple. And in fact, most people think, hey, that's me. I'm aware of present experience with acceptance. But the interesting thing is that much is revealed actually when we start doing mindfulness practices, which are training practices to try to develop mindfulness. And then what we discover is it's actually part of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is my favorite finding in social psychology. And it says that across all sorts of different activities, our actual competence is inversely proportional to our perceived competence. So
one more time. Now let's explain that.
If we think we're really good at something, maybe not. If we have doubts, we might be pretty good at it. It's kind of this Homer Simpson effect. You know, when Homer goes out to do something, he's supremely confident that he knows what he's doing. It's just us in the audience that think, well, something's wrong with this picture. Well, the same thing's true with mindfulness. Most of us think we're aware of our present experience with acceptance until we try doing some mindfulness practices, until we try actually focusing the mind, and then we discover, my God, it's a madhouse. It's always jumping to the past and the future and getting lost in thoughts. And mindfulness practices are designed to actually systematically train the mind, or we could say systematically train the brain, because we have a lot of research to support this, to be able to be in the present moment and accept our experience. And that leads to all sorts of good things. It leads to greater well-being, and it leads to being able to follow through, achieve our goals, do what we want to do in the world much more effectively.
So let me ask you a question. When somebody's amygdala has been triggered by either a thought that they're going to be harmed in a certain way by taking a risky business decision, or a thought of getting into another relationship where they've been hurt in the past, and their amygdalas, send out its fear signal, and they fight, freeze, or flee, is their natural response. Where does mindfulness come into play when those triggers are so automatic, and most people are in this pattern of, being frozen or being in a state of fear or fleeing and running away from that feeling or potential harm?
Right. It's a great question. It comes into play in 2 ways. The first is in the actual moment when we're freaked out, when we're afraid that something terrible is going to happen. We can actually turn to mindfulness practices as a kind of life preserver to get some stability in the storm. The second way it works is it develops long-term changes in brain activity that actually make us be less freaked out, make the amygdala fire somewhat less, even when we're in an externally stressing stressful situation. There's a wonderful study came out relatively recently that showed, well, let me back up. If you study rats, the amygdala, this little almond-shaped part of the brain that, as you say, is activated when we perceive ourselves to be in danger. You study rats and you put them into rat hell, basically a very aversive environment, their amygdala will grow. It'll get bigger. In humans, it turns out that if you do 8 weeks of mindfulness training, even if you don't change your external environment, your amygdala shrinks. It both fires less, and because it fires less, it actually starts to reduce in size over time. And this smaller amygdala, it's understood, is going to be less reactive generally. So it basically works two ways. One is as life preservers in the moment, but the other is a more gradual developing the capacity to have some equanimity even in the storms of life.
So what I'm also hearing is in the mindfulness practices, the first part of it is, let's say, either something intrinsically or extrinsically happens, you can train yourself to become aware of the emotion and override the natural response, or just be aware of it as opposed to overriding it. And just in that awareness, you can lower the threshold of the firing. Is that accurate?
Yes, exactly. The thing that makes this a little complicated is, ironically, it's when we learn to accept distress, we wind up being less distressed. And this is what we see in the use of mindfulness practice, because mindfulness practices now have been shown clinically, meaning in psychotherapy and in medicine, to be effective for anxiety, to be helpful for depression, to be helpful for substance abuse disorders, even to help folks who are suffering from psychosis to get less taken away, if you will, by unhelpful thought patterns. So the way it does this, though, interestingly, is not by turning off the difficulty, but by increasing people's ability to tolerate it. Let me give you an example using anxiety, since you talked about the amygdala firing. There was a wonderful story. I once heard an astronaut being interviewed by an actor who was going to play him in a movie. And this actor really wanted to get into the astronaut's head, so he said, so how did you do it? How did you have the courage to go up in these untested aircraft in the early days of the space program? I never would have had the courage. I would have been terrified. And the astronaut said, I think you're a little confused here. Courage isn't about not feeling frightened. Courage is about being able to feel fear and act anyway. Do what needs to be done, even as you feel the fear. So what happens with mindfulness practices, particularly in the early stages of practice, is they don't just reduce the fear right away. It's not like taking a tranquilizer, dulling things, or like having a drink that way. Rather, what they do is they start to increase our capacity to feel fear without being distressed about the fact that we feel fear. So we simply notice the psychophysiological arousal. We notice the heart's racing. We notice the frightened thoughts about the future. But we have this capacity to be aware of present experience with acceptance. So that means we're able to go for the whole ride, but we're not taking it so personally, and we're not so thrown off our equilibrium as a result. In the case of the astronaut, you're not thrown off your mission. In the case of any of us wanting to have a happy life, it either allows us to continue to achieve our goals, or, on the other hand, simply allows us to have some peace. Because when we stop fighting against these different feelings, we experience a whole lot less distress.
So if somebody's feeling the fear or anxiety of public speaking, or going across the bar or restaurant to ask a person if they'd like to talk, or somebody has got a business meeting that they're going to, or anything that might cause this arousal within them, what I'm hearing is the acceptance of the emotion of fear is where it begins. It's not to fight it, not to run away from it, not to suppress it, not to deflect it, but to accept it. And so in the acceptance that the fear is there, does that not exacerbate the feeling and create a self-fulfilling doom loop? Or is it a feeling or an acceptance without further judgment in that?
Great question. Initially, when we turn our attention to anything, that thing becomes more vivid.
Right.
So if right now you were to turn your attention, let's say, and we can all do this, people who are listening, you can do it, to the sensations in your left foot, you'll probably notice, oh, well, there's some tingling there, maybe some pressure, maybe it's warm or cold. And before I mentioned that, you probably weren't even aware of having a left foot. I mean, cognitively you knew it,
Right.
but you weren't focused on it. So as soon as we turn our attention to anything, it gets amplified. We experience it more vividly. But what happens with mindfulness practice is we learn to experience it more vividly, but not to start to resist it and fight it. The thing that causes any feeling to become problematic for us isn't the existence of the feeling, it's when we start to fight it. So for example, if it were fear, and let's take public speaking, that's a good one that you mentioned, and both of us do a fair amount of public speaking, so we know what it's like to sometimes feel the heart racing and anticipation and, oh, what will I say and how will I structure this? If at that moment I were to start thinking, oh my God, my heart's racing, how do I get it to stop? Because I won't be able to give the speech if my heart's racing. I'm done for. I'm going to begin, because what's going to happen is I'm going to think, how do I get it to stop? And that very action of trying to get it to stop is going to actually trigger my fight or flight system further, trigger the amygdala further, and I'm going to find even more arousal. And I'm going to think, oh my God, it's not working, it's getting worse, not better, and the thing will indeed spiral out of control. If, though, I understand how the mind works and how the brain works in these matters, and I'm able to say, no, I've learned this practice, and I've practiced it when I'm not under extreme stress, just doing mindfulness practice as a regular part of my life, I know how to be with this experience. Then what happens is it comes and it tends to go, because the wonderful thing about all feeling experience is you don't like a feeling, just wait a while. Because feelings are very much like the weather. They continue to change, and it's only our thought that this is going to be here forever, I won't be able to handle this, this is going to make it impossible to proceed successfully at my speaking. It's that thought that gets in our way. And one of the things we practice with mindfulness practice is we're constantly bringing the attention out of the thought stream, out of this narrative about our life, into what exactly is happening in the body in this moment, what's happening in the outer world in this moment. And by training our minds and our brains to do that over time, it's much easier to sort of see the thought for what it is and let it come, but let it go, so we don't identify with it in the same way. And that leads to tremendous freedom, ultimately.
As you were talking, I was being mindful of, I'm listening to you, but I'm also thinking. And what I was thinking about is it sounds like it's a skill that, as a result of some of the latest neuroscience research and finally being able to see a little bit of what's happening in the brain and getting some glimpses as to where blood flow goes and what's being activated or not. It's a skill that anyone can now learn, like a new language or playing chess or a musical instrument, versus being a victim, of what's happening in your brain and therefore, the emotions that are being activated. It sounds like it begins off as a skill where you may start off as a clumsy beginner, and with a little bit of practice, it gets easier and better, and you can observe your thoughts and emotions and let them flow like a wave might, flow to the shore, as opposed to getting into what I call as a self-fulfilling doom loop of thinking about how bad it could be.
Absolutely. And it's a skill. If we use the analogy, let's say, to physical fitness, there are many different ways to develop physical fitness. If you want to get a little bit more fit, you might take the stairs instead of the elevator, or maybe not move your car, at the mall so much when going from one end to the other, and you develop a little fitness. But if you want to take it to the next level, you'd devote some time to that. So you'd go to the gym for a workout, or you'd go for a jog or a bike ride or a brisk walk. And if you really want to get really good at physical fitness and really develop a lot of it, you might take, your next vacation could be a fitness-oriented kind of vacation. And very much in the same realm, in the same way, in the realm of mindfulness practices, we have different alternatives. There are informal practices that you can do in the midst of anything else you're doing. There's mindful walking, for example. We all walk from the car to the building. Maybe you have a dog who you walk. Maybe you walk just to enjoy the outdoors and to relax a little bit. Well, that can be done as a mindfulness practice. We all take a shower at least once in a while, right? That can be done as a mindfulness practice, where you're just staying with the sensations of the droplets of water, caressing your body. It's actually very pleasant to take a shower and to be conscious of it. You can eat mindfully. So there are things like that. And then there's formal meditation practice, which is taking time out of your day where you're not accomplishing anything else except to develop some increased mindfulness. And that can be done for a few minutes a day, or more minutes a day, and it's pretty much dose related. If you do a little bit of it, you get some mindfulness. If you do a lot of it, you get a lot of mindfulness. But you're absolutely right. It's a skill like any other, can be trained, and we now see that it makes quite measurable changes in both brain structure. In other words, the anatomy of the brain changes. One example is this shrinking of the amygdala that I mentioned. Another is the increase in size of the insula, and the insula is involved in what's called proprioception, noticing what's happening in the body in each moment. Makes sense if you're tuning into the body, that part of the brain would get bigger. But that's extremely important because that's the key to empathy. That's actually the key to successful relationships, because the way in which we know what another person is feeling is through this process called mirror neurons, in which you do something, you smile or growl or whatever, and I sense in me what I would be feeling if I were doing that, and that's how I read you. And as we know, reading one another is essential for relationships, whether at work or intimate relationships. So we see that those brain structures actually beef up, if you will, with mindfulness practice. So it's quite exciting to see how this can also change brain function. We can talk about that if you like in very desirable directions.
I love that. The interesting thing for me is that it's putting some more control in people's lives now by really just enhancing their awareness, and it's simple to do. And that means that anybody could invest, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 30 minutes a day in doing it. And it could be no matter what it is that they're doing, as you mentioned, showering, walking, getting in your car, or sitting still, or while you're exercising. And I guess the art of becoming self-aware is really something that is a phenomenal skill that I can see people gaining phenomenal benefits from. That leads me to an area that I love to focus on is why do people achieve the results that they do, or why they take action and achieve success in their lives or don't achieve success in their lives. And if somebody is aware, for example, that they're lacking confidence or they're lacking certainty or they have fear of success or fear of failure, how would you suggest that they use mindfulness as a way to make it to the next step for them to see some results in their lives?
Right. Well, there's something a little bit paradoxical about mindfulness practices, which is that in essence, we get more freedom in our life when we let go of, I would say, a certain kind of control. And the certain kind of control we let go of is the kind of anxious, what does this mean about me? How may I get my feelings hurt? How may I get disappointed if I take this or that risk? That kind of control we wind up giving up because we wind up getting more comfortable riding the roller coaster of ups and downs, which then frees us to do whatever we think is most meaningful, most useful to do with our lives. So to zero in on what to do with the fears, what happens with mindfulness practice? An example of an actual practice would be sitting and bringing one's attention with the eyes open or the eyes closed to one's breath and simply feeling the sensations of the breath. That's a very standard practice, and noticing the sensations in the body with the in-breath and with the out-breath. And you start doing that for a few moments, and I'll give some resources where our listeners can try this out. And most people notice after very few moments, zip, absolutely gone, lost in thoughts about the past or the future. And that's like, oh gosh, lost the breath, I'll come back. Zip, it just keeps going. We start to see the mind is a very, very frisky organ, and that it has a lot of trouble, staying put. But as we do that over time, each time it goes off to a thought and it comes back, we start to see thoughts less as a representation of me and more like clouds passing through the sky, or an itch that comes and goes, or the sound of traffic out there. Oh, there's another one of my catastrophic thoughts that nobody's ever going to love me. Oh, there's another one of my catastrophic thoughts that I'm never going to succeed in my career. Oh, we start to notice these things with a kind of lightness because it's just the mind doing its antics again. So it's not that the negative thoughts stop, certainly not right away, but our relationship to them changes. And what the psychologists and Others studying this say it's a little subtle, but what happens is we no longer identify with the thoughts so much. We see that they come and go. They're so dependent on our mood. When we're in a up mood, we've had some success, we feel confident. We're just filled with thoughts about where the cats meow, and we're gonna do all sorts of wonderful things. When we've had some disappointments or rejections, we're just filled with thoughts that we're no good, we're worthless, all this. We start to see that these thoughts they're mostly driven by these feelings, and they're really all untrustworthy. Neither is true in a solid sense. It's just the flow of the mind. And as we get to see this, we don't get caught in them as much, and you don't get stopped by them in the same way that when you're watching a movie, you kind of know it's a movie, so you relate to it as a movie.
And what do you do when somebody says, but listen to my story? When I was, younger, or last year, or the recession, or my husband, or my wife, and then they have the story, the excuses, the evidence to support, their thought or their belief around that. How do they go a little bit deeper into saying, is the story not true, or is the story true, and I accept it?
Well, it's interesting. Often most of our stories are partially true, right? Most of our stories have a grain of truth to them, but then they're usually embellished with models that we picked up as kids. I think of my, nobody ever thought that I was smart when I was a kid, or nobody ever thought that I was strong or popular. These kinds of thoughts. We all have our injuries, right, about this kind of thing. Or I must always be, you fill in the blank, which is to compensate for all the disappointed feelings that I ever had about this. So we can see the stories, but the critical thing is ultimately none of us, and this may be a little odd to say on your program, but none of us is actually a winner or a loser, right? We're all human beings in this together. We're all doing the best that we can, and we all win and lose in various ways. The thing that locks us in to self-defeating behaviors is believing that we're one or the other and thinking it always has to be that way, as opposed to thinking, I'm a human being like other human beings. I have some strengths, I have some weaknesses. How am I going to capitalize on my strengths, use them to do what's meaningful to me in the world, and see that the whole constant roller coaster of self-esteem, I'm great, I'm terrible, I'm great, I'm terrible, I'm great, I'm terrible. Sometimes we can cycle, several times in an hour, if we're really careful to watch the mind. That whole thing is just a little bit of craziness that's built into us as humans. And actually, I'd just like to elaborate on that for a moment.
Yeah, I'd love you to. You reminded me of something that we refer to as habit hell, and but keep elaborating on that. I love hearing this.
Well, I'm actually reminded of traveling in Africa, and nothing exotic. I was there as a tourist, but I was exotic, but nothing courageous, I should say. I was there as a tourist, and seeing the various animal species, and in virtually every animal species, you'd see the same thing. Like, there's the dominant male, there's his harem of the reproductively prime females. They're the females wanting to get into the harem, and they're the guys doing the species equivalent of playing basketball, honing their skills so that someday they could be the dominant male. And you start to see, my God, the antelopes are doing it, the elephants are doing it, you see every mammal species, the rats do it. We start to realize we're hardwired ourselves to be terribly concerned with our rank in the primate troop, if you will. Primates, we're very social animals, and the way this translates for us is these preoccupations with self-esteem. What does everybody think of me? What will they think of me if I have this success or this failure? And one of the things we learn through mindfulness practice is those are just thoughts, and we don't have to attach to them. This isn't saying that we shouldn't accomplish something if we want to accomplish something. You want to set out and cure cancer? Dynamite. Go do it. You want to do something in which you'll wind up wealthy? No problem there either. But it's about seeing that the whole self-esteem roller coaster is ultimately not something where we can win and stay winning. that we win when we start to see those are thoughts coming and going, and I don't have to attach to them. I can do what the situation calls for as these thoughts come and go. And mindfulness practice is wonderful training for not getting so caught in that stuff, and as a result, not getting in our own way.
I love that. One of the things that just rang very, very true to me is this really is giving people permission that's evidence-based and neurologically sound, and it's okay to change your paradigm of what you thought you should be focusing on and thinking about, and change that paradigm, change the construct of the dialogue. And in doing that, you can have a hell of a lot more peace and well-being and fulfillment and happiness and joy and pretty much everything else that you're really looking for anyway.
Absolutely. It's the idea that we can actually take refuge in reality. It's our thoughts about reality that make us miserable. Reality, even though, look, some elements are difficult. We get sick, we grow old, we lose loved ones. I don't want to be Pollyanna about this, but even that, the idea that we could learn to accept the fact that everything keeps changing instead of always be kicking and screaming, trying to make the world into how we imagine it's supposed to be, rather than learn to be with it and effectively deal with its challenges.
So the key is self-acceptance, acceptance of what is, what might be, what might not be, the world as it is, and in that you find a lot of inner peace to do that.
Absolutely, and also freedom from, basically our delusional thoughts, and we all have them. We all have, these thoughts about who we think we are or are supposed to be and all of that. And we start to feel much more, another enormous benefit of this is we wind up feeling connected to our fellow human beings. Because we start to notice, oh, my mind does all this crazy stuff. Everybody else's mind does all this crazy stuff. We're really in this quite together. And, we might as well be friends with each other, given the challenges of living with a human mind. And mindfulness practices really help with that too, because if we're in an intimate relationship and our partner does something that annoys us, instead of immediately being activated to, I must stand up for myself, I must attack them back, and the kind of stuff that makes everything devolve into a fight where people are miserable and hate each other for a long time. Instead of doing that, we can start to know, all right, so what got triggered there? What hurt my feelings? We wind up having much more flexibility because this gap opens up between a feeling arising and acting on that feeling. And having that gap it's critical for relationships. Anybody who's ever raised a child knows, I have a friend, Trudy Goodman, who's a meditation teacher and a psychologist, and she talks about parenting crimes. And those are all the things we can't believe we ever did as a parent, but we did them. The times we lost it here or lost it there. All of that stuff happens because we don't have sufficient mindfulness to notice the feeling arising and then have this moment where there's a gap, where there's a choice about how are we going to act on this feeling. It's when the feeling comes and we move right into action. So mindfulness helps us there too. It helps us connect to one another.
It's interesting. The beauty of what I'm sensing right now is it really gives us the ability to observe and to be with what is and suspend the judgment, and more importantly, I think, accept what is and not label it as good or bad, but just is. And in that acceptance, I think it sounds like we're not deactivating, but possibly lowering the emotional unpleasant charge that many of us are looking to move away from and move more towards the pleasant emotions and feelings that we want. And so
Yeah, I was going to say absolutely. There's a wonderful study, since I know you're interested in brain science. This is Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
Yep.
And it's long been known from studying normal people, also known as college sophomores, that because that's his recruiter for these studies, but it applies to grown-ups too, that when people are in states of mind that are creative, peaceful, loving, those kinds of things, there's a lot of left prefrontal activation in this part behind the forehead, the left side. And when people are hypervigilant, depressed, anxious, the amygdala is activated and they're threatened, there's a lot of right prefrontal activation. And he tried, well, let's try some people who have done a lot of mindfulness practice. And he wired up some Tibetan monks who had been doing this for thousands and thousands of hours, and they were off the charts in terms of the degree to which they had left prefrontal activation. The left side was totally active, the right side was pretty quiet. But he was a good scientist, and he said, well, could it be that people who become monks in Tibet are wired that way to begin with? Maybe that's why they become monks. They're just, very peaceful people. Let's check it out. So they took stressed out biotech workers, and they took half of them and put half of them through 8 weeks of mindfulness training. The other half was on a wait list. And before the study, everybody had a lot of right prefrontal activation because they were stressed out biotech workers. After the study, the group who had mindfulness training had much more left prefrontal activation and were reporting better moods and less conflicts at work and this kind of stuff. They also gave everybody a flu shot at that time, at the midway point, and the people who had been through the mindfulness training had a more robust response to the flu vaccine. So their immune system was working better because they were less stressed out. Then they ran the second group, the second half, through the same training program and looked at them, and they had moved left as well. So there wasn't anything peculiar about the first group. It was the practice that did it. So we see, this is one of the studies of brain function, that it's measurable. These patterns of brain activity that are associated with well-being occur more often when people do more of these practices.
I love that. And so in order for people to find out more about your work and to pick up the Mindful Solution book, they can get the Mindful Solution book at Amazon, which is where I got it from. And I know you also have a website with some great meditations and a way for them to follow your work and keep looking at what you're doing and how you're doing it and find out more about the research. So where would you like me to send the people that are watching and listening to this?
Sure. If you want to just experiment, just try a little bit of mindfulness practice yourself, check it out. Go to www.mindfulness-solution.com, mindfulness-solution.com, and you'll see there's a tab that's download meditations, and there's about 30 of them, maybe 25 there. There are different meditations that are useful for anxiety, for depression, for different conditions, but they're simple breath meditations, walking meditations, things like this. The recorded meditations are free. You can download them. You can listen to them. You can put them on your phone, your iPod, anything like that. You're welcome to check out the Mindfulness Solution book, which will give you much more detailed instructions about how to establish a practice, how you can do it in the midst of a busy life, and then how to use these practices to work with everyday difficulties. And you can get that on Amazon, and there's a link on the website as well. If you'd like to pursue that.
Yeah,
but you can get the meditations for free to check it out.
Yeah, and I suggest everybody pick up 2 books, one for yourself and one to give away. So don't just pick up one. Ron, do you take on private clients as well, if people want to get a hold of you?
I do. I tend to be pretty backed up with a pretty extensive waiting list, so I don't encourage that
no problem.
In a big way. One of the things about lecturing all over the world and writing books is people seek you out, which is wonderful, but I have somewhat limited clinical hours. But I do do clinical work, and you can contact me through the website.
No problem. So everybody pick up 2 books of the Mindfulness Solution with Dr. Ron Siegel, and what you will find are some amazing tools, techniques, and resources to really gain more happiness, more joy, more love, more fulfillment in your life and in the lives of those around you. So, Ron, I want to thank you so much for investing the time with me. I hope I can serve you in some capacity in the near future.
Well, you already have by inviting me to be with you on this, so thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much. All right, everybody, remember, it's your choice to create an amazing life, and part of that is to take action. So go to Ron's website. I'll have a link on the bottom of this interview, so you can go there, get the audios that he's got there for some meditations, and pick up 2 copies of the book and give one away as a great gift. Ron, thank you so much, and have an amazing day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.